The courtroom was bustling with the usual energy of legal professionals and bystanders. It was an ordinary day in the county courthouse, filled with the sounds of rustling papers and the quiet murmurs of people waiting for their turn. Everyone seemed to be in a hurry. Their movements rushed as they focused on their cases. In the back of the room, a figure caught the attention of those nearby. He walked in slowly, cane in hand, his every step careful, as though the act of simply moving across the floor required more effort than it should. His suit was slightly old-fashioned, the fabric worn and frayed in a few places, but it was clearly well kept. Despite the way he moved, it was clear he wasn't the kind of person to draw attention to himself, but somehow today, he had managed to stand out. He made his way to the front of the room, where a small stack of legal papers sat waiting for him. His name had been called earlier, but he had only just arrived. It was a moment of vulnerability for him, one he was no stranger to. The case he was about to argue wasn't an easy one. It was a personal matter, something he had to fight for on his own. The legal world wasn't an easy place for people like him, people who had been broken down in one way or another and were now forced to pick up the pieces. As he placed his briefcase on the table and adjusted his cane, there was a soft chuckle from the opposing side. A lawyer, younger than him by a good decade, exchanged looks with the other attorneys. It wasn't a glance of confidence, but one that seemed to say, "This should be easy." The courtroom murmured with the quiet buzz of curiosity. The judge, sitting at the front with his head slightly tilted, peered over his glasses. Judge Harper, a middle-aged man with sharp features, let out a small, almost imperceptible sigh. He looked down at his notes and then back at the man before him. It was clear that this wasn't the type of case he had anticipated. He adjusted the gavel in his hand, his eyes now focused on the man who had just walked into the room. "Well, well, well," Judge Harper said, his voice cutting through the quiet like a knife. He smiled in a way that didn't seem to reach his eyes. Another self-proclaimed lawyer looking to take up court time. How lovely. The comment was followed by a few scattered chuckles from the attorneys on the other side of the room. A brief ripple of laughter passed through the gallery, and for a moment the man at the table looked like he was about to shrink back. But he didn't. He simply stood there, hands folded in front of him, his expression calm but serious. It was as though he had heard worse and had long stopped being rattled by small comments like that. "Mr. Reynolds," the judge continued, his voice laced with sarcasm now, "you've been assigned to represent yourself in this matter." "How charming." He paused, glancing at his notes again. "I trust you've prepared everything you need for your case. I would hate to see you waste our time." Michael Reynolds didn't react immediately. He wasn't sure if the judge was mocking him because of his disability, or because he had come to court without an attorney. Maybe it was both. But he wasn't here to argue with the judge. He was here for something far more important, something that had been taken from him unjustly. He adjusted his glasses and took a steadying breath. He opened the briefcase slowly, taking out a few pages. His hands weren't shaking, though the effort it took to move them was evident. It was something he had learned to live with after the accident. His body, injured in ways that most people could never understand, didn't always cooperate with him. But his mind was sharp, and that was what mattered. For a moment, the room grew quiet again, everyone waiting for him to begin. The opposing lawyer seemed uninterested, flipping through a folder in front of him, barely acknowledging the fact that he was about to face off against a man who, even without a lawyer at his side, had something more valuable than any other legal weapon: his knowledge of the law. Judge Harper, clearly amused by the delay, glanced down at his watch. "Are you ready to begin, Mr. Reynolds?" he asked, his tone dripping with mock politeness. Michael looked up at him then, meeting the judge's gaze without hesitation. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady but firm. "And I'm not here to waste anyone's time." There was a small pause. The judge stared at him for a moment longer than necessary before nodding. "All right," Judge Harper said, with a hint of disbelief in his voice. "Proceed." Michael cleared his throat and began. His words were calm and measured, carefully choosing each one before speaking. He wasn't the type to rush through a case, not when so much was at stake. He talked about his background, about his time in the military, about the injuries he had sustained while serving his country. He spoke about the paperwork that had been mishandled and how it had affected his ability to receive the veteran benefits he was entitled to. As he spoke, his legal expertise became clear. The opposing attorney, initially dismissive, began to take notice. Michael's arguments were precise, his knowledge impeccable. He wasn't just rambling about injustice. He was presenting facts, quoting laws, and referencing legal precedents that the opposing side had clearly overlooked. For the first time, the courtroom seemed to quiet, not because of any particular tension, but because of the stark realization that Michael wasn't just a veteran trying to argue for what was rightfully his. He was a man who had fought battles in the courtroom just as fiercely as he had on the battlefield. He had seen his fair share of injustice, and today he was here to correct it. The judge's expression shifted. The smirk he had worn at the beginning of the trial faded, replaced by a more neutral look. He shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk. He didn't interrupt. Instead, he listened, really listened, as Michael continued to speak, his voice unwavering and strong. It was clear now that this wasn't just another case. Michael was no amateur. He was, in fact, more than capable of representing himself. Perhaps he was more than the judge had initially assumed. The opposing attorney began to shuffle papers nervously. A few of the younger clerks glanced at one another, their eyes wide with surprise. Michael's words weren't just legal jargon. They were the carefully considered arguments of someone who understood the system better than most. He wasn't just a man seeking justice. He was someone who had lived it, breathed it, and fought for it. And as the minutes passed, one thing became undeniable. Michael Reynolds was not here to be mocked. He was here to win. Michael Reynolds wasn't always the man that the courtroom saw today. In fact, he wasn't always even close to it. As a young man, he had been full of ambition and dreams just like any other. He joined the military right after high school, drawn by the sense of duty that ran deep in his family. For years, he had watched older relatives serve with honor, and it felt like the right path for him. He quickly made a name for himself, rising through the ranks. But it wasn't just his skills as a soldier that set him apart. Michael had always been quick with his mind. He had a sharp understanding of strategy, the kind of mind that could read people and situations with an almost uncanny clarity. It wasn't long before he caught the attention of the Army's legal department. At first, it seemed like an odd fit. The Army, legal work? The two didn't seem to go hand in hand, but Michael was a quick learner. He had a natural aptitude for law, and it wasn't long before he became a standout. It was during his time as a JAG officer that Michael truly began to realize his passion. He helped defend soldiers who had been accused of everything from misconduct to crimes they didn't commit. In a world where accusations could ruin lives, he became the protector of those who couldn't defend themselves. One case in particular stood out. A fellow soldier had been wrongfully accused of war crimes, and the situation was tense, with pressure coming from all sides to make a quick judgment. Michael spent sleepless nights going through evidence, combing through every detail to find a shred of truth. After weeks of hard work, he uncovered the real story, a story that wasn't pretty, but it was the truth. In a tense courtroom, he stood firm, presenting the facts with undeniable clarity. It was his most significant victory, and it wasn't just the win that mattered, it was knowing he had made a difference. But with every victory, there came a cost. The war had a toll on him that no one could see. It wasn't the kind of injury that left scars or broken bones. It was the mental toll, the weight of the lives he had to fight for, the people who came to him broken, and the faces of those who were lost in the shuffle of a system that didn't always seem to care. He had learned early on how to bury his emotions, how to keep them hidden behind a wall of professionalism, but over time that wall began to crack. The day it all came crashing down was sudden, though not entirely unexpected. It was in Afghanistan, during a mission that was supposed to be routine. The mission, as with so many before it, went horribly wrong. There was an explosion, the sound of it ringing in Michael's ears long after it had ended. The next thing he knew, he was waking up in a hospital bed, his body broken in ways that no one had expected. He had suffered severe injuries, fractured bones, shrapnel embedded deep in his flesh, and most notably, a damaged leg that would never fully heal. It wasn't just the pain of the injury itself. It was the feeling of being completely helpless for the first time in his life. He had always prided himself on his strength, his ability to fight through the hardest of situations. But now he couldn't even walk without assistance. He was no longer the soldier, the protector. He was the one who needed protection. The transition back to civilian life was harder than Michael had ever imagined. He had given so much of himself to the military, to the idea of service, that now, with nothing but time and a broken body, he didn't know who he was anymore. He couldn't do the things he used to do: run, train, be a leader on the field. He was a stranger in his own skin, and it was something he struggled to accept. It was during this dark period that Michael began to find his way back to the law. He enrolled in law school after his recovery, and it wasn't out of some grand desire to keep fighting. No, it was simpler than that. He had always been good at law, and he realized that it could give him a purpose. It could help him move forward, even if his body couldn't keep up with the past. The years that followed were difficult, filled with physical therapy, countless surgeries, and a constant struggle against the limitations of his body. But with every setback, he found new ways to adapt. His legal career flourished, and slowly but surely, he became known for his sharp legal mind. He specialized in veterans' law, helping other veterans navigate the complex system that so often failed them. He knew what it was like to fight for what you deserved, and he became a lifeline for so many who had been left behind. It was around this time that Michael's own issues with the VA began. He had always done everything by the book, never missing a step when it came to his benefits. He had followed the rules, submitted the necessary paperwork, and waited patiently for the benefits he was entitled to. But when the check didn't come and the phone calls were met with endless delays and excuses, he realized that he too was a victim of a broken system. He wasn't the type to sit back and let things slide. He had always been a fighter, and this was no different. But when he tried to resolve the issue, the process was so full of red tape and miscommunication that it felt like he was being silenced on purpose. As months turned into years, Michael's frustration grew, but he refused to back down. That's when he made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He decided to represent himself. It was a move that many people would have deemed reckless. After all, Michael was a veteran, not a full-time attorney. But in his mind, it wasn't about the title. It was about standing up for himself, for the thousands of other veterans who had been forgotten by the very system that was supposed to take care of them. He knew the case was complicated. He knew he was up against lawyers who had years of experience. But Michael had something that no one could take from him: his knowledge of the law and his ability to fight for what was right. He wasn't some unprepared amateur. He was a man who had spent his entire life fighting for justice, and he wasn't about to let that change now. The courtroom that day, where he was mocked by the judge and the opposing lawyer, was just another battle in a long line of struggles. The case he was about to argue was personal, but it was also part of a larger fight. A fight for every veteran who had been overlooked, dismissed, or wronged by a system that wasn't built to care for them. He had been down this road before. He knew how to navigate the complexities of law, the ways people would try to undermine him, and the tactics they would use to make him feel small. But Michael didn't feel small. Not today. Today, he was the one in control. Today, he was the one who was going to make sure his voice was heard no matter what. The courtroom was tense. The judge, who had initially seemed amused by Michael's presence, was now leaning forward, his eyes narrowing with focus. The opposing attorney, once so dismissive, was now flipping through pages with increasing speed, clearly uncomfortable. Michael, still standing at the table, didn't notice the shift in energy. He had been here before, fighting battles big and small with the same calm determination. He knew that when it came down to it, facts were all that mattered, and he was armed with them. Michael cleared his throat and continued speaking, his voice steady and firm. He had done his research, and the law was on his side. He had spent weeks, no months, preparing for this day. It wasn't just about the money or the benefits. It was about something deeper, something more personal. The system had failed him, and he wasn't going to let it happen to anyone else. He started with the evidence, the piles of paperwork that the Department of Veterans Affairs had buried him under. He laid out the timeline of his case, showing how he had submitted all the necessary forms, how he had followed every instruction to the letter, only to have the VA repeatedly deny him the benefits he was entitled to. The case was simple in theory. He had earned these benefits through his service, and yet, the very system meant to honor him had treated him as if he didn't exist. He began explaining the letters he had received, official letters, stamped with the VA's seal, telling him that they had lost his records, that they couldn't find his medical history, or that his paperwork was incomplete. He had filed appeals. He had submitted documents again and again. But the answers were always the same. Nothing. Silence. The kind of silence that made you feel invisible. With every word, Michael felt the weight of those years pressing down on him. It wasn't just the denial of benefits, it was the disrespect, the indifference, the feeling that he didn't matter, that his service, his sacrifice didn't count. He paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the room. The opposing attorney had stopped flipping through papers. He was watching Michael now, his face unreadable. Michael pressed on. He referenced specific laws, legal precedents, and even court cases where veterans in similar situations had been wronged. He showed that the system's failures weren't just isolated incidents. They were part of a much larger pattern of negligence. The more he spoke, the more the room seemed to shift. The judge, who had initially mocked him, was now listening closely. His posture had changed. He wasn't leaning back in his chair anymore. He was leaning forward, his fingers tapping nervously on the desk in front of him. The young lawyer, who had earlier dismissed Michael's case as unimportant, was no longer so confident. He shifted in his seat, glancing at his papers, then at his colleagues, then back at Michael. He had assumed this would be an easy win. After all, the man standing before him was just a veteran, an old man with a cane, not a real lawyer. But Michael was not just any veteran. He was a man who had spent his life learning the law, understanding it, and using it to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. As Michael continued, he saw the subtle shift in the room. People were paying attention now. No one was laughing. No one was underestimating him anymore. Even the judge's tone had softened. The mocking words that had come so easily earlier were gone. Now the judge's voice was more measured, more cautious. "Mr. Reynolds," the judge said, breaking the silence, "I must admit I didn't expect this level of detail. You've certainly done your homework." Michael didn't respond immediately. He wasn't here for praise. He didn't need the judge's approval. All he needed was for the truth to be heard. The young lawyer had begun to argue, but his words lacked conviction. He stumbled over his points, unsure how to counter the overwhelming evidence Michael had laid out. There was no simple excuse for what had happened. No easy way out. The mistakes the VA had made were right there, clear for everyone to see, and Michael was only getting started. He took a step forward, feeling the weight of what he was about to do. The stakes were high. This wasn't just about him. It was about every single veteran who had been ignored, forgotten, or outright dismissed. It was about everyone who had put their lives on the line for their country, only to be treated as if they didn't matter. Michael was here not just for his own benefits, but for the countless others who had faced the same struggle. He was speaking for all of them. The men and women who had served with pride, who had fought on foreign soil, who had come back broken, only to find the system that was supposed to help them was the one thing that kept holding them down. As he spoke, his words grew sharper. The passion behind them grew stronger. He wasn't just talking about facts and figures anymore. He was talking about something deeper, the dignity of every single person who had ever served in the military. It wasn't just about paperwork. It was about honor. It was about respect. It was about doing right by the people who had given everything for their country. The judge was silent for a long moment after Michael finished. His expression had changed entirely. Gone was the condescending smile. Gone was the doubt in his eyes. Now there was only a look of quiet realization, as if he had finally understood the true weight of what Michael was saying. Michael didn't wait for the judge to speak. He had said what he needed to say. He had laid out his case. The facts were there. The evidence was undeniable. All that was left now was for the court to decide. The opposing lawyer shifted in his chair, finally looking up from his papers. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I would like to request a short recess," he said, his voice uncertain. "I believe we need to reevaluate some of the points raised." The judge didn't immediately respond. He just stared at the lawyer for a moment, then nodded. "Fine. We'll take a short recess. Mr. Reynolds, you'll have your chance to respond when we return." As the courtroom began to buzz with conversation, Michael remained calm, sitting back in his chair. He wasn't worried. He had done what he came to do. The truth had been spoken, and it had resonated. It wasn't just the judge who was listening now, it was everyone in that room. The ones who had once laughed at him, the ones who had underestimated him, were now forced to take him seriously. As the door to the courtroom closed behind them, Michael leaned back in his chair, his eyes closed for a moment. He didn't feel a sense of victory yet. That would come later if it came at all. But for now, he allowed himself a quiet moment of satisfaction. He had stood his ground. He had made them listen, and that in itself was a victory. The break was brief. It didn't take long for the attorneys and the judge to return to the courtroom. But during that short pause, the tension in the air was palpable. Michael remained seated at the table, feeling an odd mix of exhaustion and anticipation. His mind raced with thoughts of the case, of everything he had said so far. But most of all, he thought about the bigger picture. This wasn't just about him. It wasn't even just about the benefits that were owed to him. It was about showing the world that veterans like him were not to be ignored, that they deserved respect. When the judge returned to his seat and banged his gavel, the room fell into a hush. The opposing attorney was already at his table, looking even more uncomfortable than before. It was clear that the tone of the courtroom had changed in ways he hadn't expected. Michael, however, was still calm. He had done his part. Now it was up to the judge to decide how this would play out. Judge Harper's voice broke the silence. "We've had time to review the arguments," he said, his tone much more neutral than it had been before. "Mr. Reynolds, I have to admit that your case has raised some significant questions about the handling of your claims. But this court must still weigh the evidence against the law." Michael listened closely. He had expected this. The law was the law, and no matter how much he had shown the judge that the system had failed him, there were still procedures to follow. But he had already made his point. The system had been broken and it needed to be fixed. "I've read the information you provided," Judge Harper continued, "and while the VA's mishandling of your paperwork is concerning, the law is still the law. I'm afraid it's not as simple as you've made it out to be." Michael could feel the weight of the judge's words. He wasn't surprised by them, but they stung nonetheless. This was what he had expected. The system was designed to be slow, cumbersome, and at times downright hostile to people like him. But he wasn't going to let that stop him. He had fought in the military, and he had fought on behalf of other veterans in the courtroom. This wasn't the time to back down. He couldn't. The opposing attorney jumped in, taking advantage of the judge's hesitation. "Your Honor, with all due respect, Mr. Reynolds has made a compelling argument, but the law is not on his side in this case. The VA has specific procedures that must be followed, and these claims have to be processed through the proper channels. While I sympathize with Mr. Reynolds' situation, his case simply doesn't meet the criteria for approval." Michael's heart sank, but he didn't show it. He knew this was coming. The opposing attorney was trying to box him in with rules and regulations, just like every other time he had dealt with the VA. But this time, Michael wasn't going to be trapped by technicalities. The judge looked at the opposing lawyer, then back at Michael. "Mr. Reynolds," he said, "do you have anything else to add before I make my decision?" Michael felt a moment of hesitation. He could sense the weight of this moment. Everything he had worked for, everything he had fought for came down to this. He took a deep breath and stood up from his chair, meeting the judge's gaze. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady, "I'm not here to change the law. I'm here because the law was not followed. I'm here because the system failed. And if we keep accepting these failures as just the way things are, then we've lost sight of what justice really means." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. The room was completely silent now. Even the opposing attorney had stopped fidgeting with his papers. Michael continued, "I've seen it firsthand. Veterans like me who have served their country and given everything only to be forgotten when it's time for the system to take care of us. This isn't just about a handful of benefits. It's about respect. It's about doing what's right." He let the words sink in, then added, "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for fairness. The same fairness that this court would grant to anyone else. I've done my part. Now it's time for the system to do its part." The silence in the room was thick, the tension almost unbearable. The judge looked at Michael for a long time, his face unreadable. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he spoke. "You make a valid point," Judge Harper said slowly. "This court does not exist to uphold a broken system. And you're right, Mr. Reynolds. The law is meant to protect those who have served, not push them aside." There was a pause. Michael's heart raced. Had the judge really just said that? I'm going to take some time to review everything you've presented, Judge Harper continued. But let me be clear. This court is not here to rubber stamp decisions made by the VA. You've made a strong case, and I will give it the attention it deserves. Michael didn't know what to say. For the first time in this entire process, the words "thank you" felt completely inadequate. He had come here for justice, not for thanks, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like the system might actually be willing to listen. The judge looked at the opposing attorney and then back at Michael. We'll reconvene in 2 weeks. In the meantime, I expect both parties to prepare any additional evidence or arguments they believe may be relevant. The gavel slammed down, signaling the end of the session. The room slowly began to empty out, but Michael didn't move right away. He stayed seated, his mind still spinning from the judge's words. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, he allowed himself a small moment of hope. The attorney for the opposing side gave him a pointed look as he walked past, but Michael didn't react. The fight wasn't over yet, but this felt different. The fight wasn't just his own anymore. He could feel that the room, the judge, even the opposing lawyer, had been forced to see him as something more than just a man with a cane. He was a force to be reckoned with, and he had made them understand that. In the days that followed, Michael couldn't help but reflect on everything that had brought him to this point. The years of physical therapy, the sleepless nights spent poring over legal documents, the countless times the VA had ignored his calls or lost his paperwork. It had all led to this moment where he had stood up in that courtroom and demanded the respect he was owed. Not just as a veteran, but as a person. He knew the battle wasn't over, and that the next 2 weeks would be just as important as the ones that had come before. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of control. He had made them see the truth, and now they couldn't ignore it. Whatever the outcome, Michael knew that he had fought with everything he had. And that, no matter what happened, was the real victory. 2 weeks felt like a lifetime. For Michael, the days seemed to drag on. Every moment was consumed by the uncertainty of what would happen in the courtroom. He had prepared everything he could, but in the back of his mind, he knew that the final decision rested with the judge. He couldn't control what was about to happen, but he could hold on to the one thing that had always kept him grounded, his belief in doing what was right. The day of the final hearing arrived with little fanfare. Michael had woken up early, as he always did, but today was different. The nerves he had once felt walking into the courtroom were now replaced with a quiet determination. He had done everything he could to present his case, everything he could to ensure that the truth was heard. Now he was ready for whatever came next. The courtroom was nearly the same as before, with the same faces in the same seats. The judge, however, seemed different. He wasn't the man who had mocked Michael just weeks ago. The transformation in his demeanor was palpable. Judge Harper appeared more focused, his expression thoughtful, as though he had been wrestling with the decision for days. When the gavel came down, signaling the start of the session, Michael took a deep breath and stood. He could feel the weight of every set of eyes in the room on him. But this time it didn't feel oppressive. This time it felt empowering. The judge glanced briefly at both sides before speaking. "Mr. Reynolds," he began, his voice steady, "I've reviewed everything presented in this case. Your argument has been heard, and the facts you've laid out cannot be ignored." Michael's heart raced as he absorbed the judge's words. He had expected this moment to feel like a victory, but now, as it was unfolding, it felt almost unreal. The fact that his voice had been heard in a system designed to silence him was something he still couldn't quite comprehend. "I've taken time to reflect on the law. On the actions, or rather, the lack of action on behalf of the VA," Judge Harper continued. "I've also considered your personal circumstances and the experiences you've shared with this court. While the law is rigid, it's also meant to serve the people, and when the system fails, when it breaks down as it has in your case, we must question whether justice is being served." Michael's hands trembled slightly, but he clenched them into fists, grounding himself. His mind went back to the long hours spent reviewing every document, every letter from the VA. He thought of the countless veterans who had walked this same path, hoping for a fair hearing but often finding themselves ignored. He thought of the frustration, the anger, the feeling of being unheard. He had fought for those veterans as much as he had fought for himself. The judge's eyes flicked toward the opposing attorney. "Counsel," he said, his voice sharper now, You've made your arguments, but the facts don't support your position. The evidence is clear. The VA failed Mr. Reynolds in numerous ways. This court cannot, in good conscience, allow these failures to go unchallenged. The opposing lawyer opened his mouth to respond, but the judge held up his hand, silencing him. "I'm not finished," Judge Harper said. Michael could feel the room's energy shift. The opposing attorney, who had seemed so confident before, was now stammering, caught off guard. The judge's words had left him no room for defense. "You've tried to argue that Mr. Reynolds' case doesn't meet the criteria, but that argument ignores the fact that the system he's up against has failed him. This isn't a matter of paperwork or procedures. This is about a veteran who has sacrificed his health and well-being for his country, only to be treated as though he doesn't matter. And that," the judge paused, "that is something we cannot ignore." Michael's heart beat faster as the judge continued. "Therefore, after careful consideration, I find in favor of Mr. Reynolds. The VA is hereby ordered to review his claim immediately, without further delay, and to ensure that he is granted the benefits to which he is entitled. The VA must also provide a full accounting of how and why his case was mishandled in the first place." The gavel came down, and for a brief moment, everything in the courtroom seemed to pause. Michael felt a rush of emotions flood through him: relief, pride, and most of all, gratitude. The weight of years spent fighting against a system that had forgotten him finally seemed to lift. He had won, not just for himself but for all the veterans who had been ignored, pushed aside, or denied their rights. The judge's voice broke through his thoughts. "This case serves as a reminder that we must hold systems accountable. It's easy to overlook the individuals caught in those systems, but they deserve more. I hope this case will encourage others to speak up when they are wronged." Michael barely heard the rest of the judge's words. His mind was already racing, imagining what would come next. The judge had given him what he needed, the chance to be heard. But more than that, he had affirmed that veterans like him mattered. His fight had not been in vain. The opposing attorney gathered his papers, still trying to process the decision. He walked past Michael without a word, but Michael didn't mind. The victory wasn't about gloating or proving anyone wrong. It was about standing up for what was right. As Michael made his way out of the courtroom, he could feel a sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't just about the legal victory. It was about reclaiming his dignity, about standing tall in the face of a system that had treated him like an afterthought. He had taken on a broken system, and for the first time the system had listened. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Outside the courthouse, the bright sun hit his face. It felt warmer than usual, as though the world itself had shifted. Michael leaned on his cane, a small smile tugging at his lips. The battle wasn't over. There would always be more work to do, but today he had taken a step forward, not just for himself, but for every person who had ever fought for their country and been left behind. As he walked down the steps, he saw a group of veterans gathered nearby, talking and laughing. They didn't know the outcome of his case yet, but Michael didn't need to explain. They had all been in the trenches together, fighting in their own ways for the rights they deserved. Today, he knew they had all won, even if they hadn't yet realized it. For a long time, Michael had wondered if it was worth it. He had doubted himself, his strength, his ability to stand up to a system that seemed too big to fight. But now he knew that his voice mattered, and even if no one else had heard it before, they had heard it now. As he walked toward the group of veterans, one of them looked up and smiled. "How'd it go, Mike?" he asked, his voice hopeful. Michael didn't answer right away. Instead, he gave a small, knowing smile and nodded. "We won," he said simply. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like the world was right again.